Hello and welcome to our podcast on film genres. This is going to be the first in a few series where we talk about what a film genre is, kind of where they came from, what the common genres are, and what are some of the general rules of this type of category for film. We're then going to follow that up with some looks at specific genres, the Western, the musical, and the gangster film. But let's go ahead and get started and see what we're talking about here. So a basic definition of the word genre is just a category or a type of something. So just like in literature class, when we have genres or groupings of texts, such as science fiction, historical fiction, fantasy, etc., we have the same type of idea working in film class. We can see some patterns that kind of bind certain films together into groups. So how exactly did these genres develop? Well, it wasn't like somebody came up and said, let's make a whole bunch of movies that are built on the Western idea, where we have a cowboy, good guy, bad guy, the good guy comes in to save the town, that kind of stuff. Actually, these genres kind of came about the other way around, where studios wanted to standardize products, and so they were looking for ways to make a lot of films relatively quickly so that they could put them out into the market. People would go to them, people would spend money, studios would make money. And so what they learned was when they discovered some really nice patterns that the audience seemed to like, the studios would just kind of repeat those patterns over and over again, maybe interchanging a few actors here and there, maybe tweaking the storyline just a little bit, but still retaining the original story or character grouping that audiences seemed to like. Eventually, studios kind of realized that people would like unique films too. So we have this little push-pull going on where the studios want to crank out more movies as quickly as possible. Audiences are saying, yeah, those are okay. But we also like when something is different that we haven't seen before. And so the word genre being applied to film didn't really get applied while studios were making these groups of films that were so similar. It's kind of when film historians were able to look back and say, interesting, do you notice a pattern here? All of these ones that are set in the West kind of follow a pattern. Perhaps that is the Western genre. We start to see the patterns in retrospect. So kind of that whole idea of hindsight is 20/20 going on. This label gets applied after much of the genre series had been developed. So what are some of the common genres and how do we classify these? Like we mentioned before, the Western, gangster, musical, the romantic comedy, things like these four and others where we tend to see patterns. Many Westerns look alike. They have a very similar story, they have a similar batch of characters, the problem is usually around the same. A bad guy or force or person comes into a town and some other loner guy who usually wears a cowboy hat and a vest needs to come in and save the town. So as we talk generally about the idea of genre, here are some terms that will kind of help us span the different genres that we look at. In each one, we tend to have stock characters, meaning that in any genre, that genre has the same group of characters every single time. So we're going to have in the Western, we're always going to have the bad guy, the good guy, the bartender, the fallen woman or prostitute, the pure woman, or usually the minister's daughter. So these characters are flat. They don't change and grow. They're just there to kind of populate the landscape. They are secondary, meaning that they're not all that important to the story. We need to have them in order to be part of the genre, but they don't always progress the plot all that much. They're just part of the landscape of these genres. Another way to think about it is the idea of reality TV. Reality TV isn't reality. It is still pretty much controlled by producers and the studios that make them. In addition, think about the way these shows are cast. They don't just let anybody into the real world series. They were always looking for a very set combination of 6 or 7 people. It wasn't truly the real world where we get all kinds of diversity. They were looking for these very specific stock kind of stereotypes. We need somebody who's going to be ditzy. We need somebody who's going to be of color. We need somebody who's going to be racist. We need somebody who is gay. We need somebody who is homophobic. Because the producers of these shows weren't out there to just capture reality. They wanted to create their own reality. That's a topic for a whole nother podcast. But think about stock characters in genres as the common types of characters you see over and over again throughout the evolution of a genre. Additionally, genres have consistent themes, or in other words, thematic issues. And the way we talk about those are that themes are the lessons that we should walk away with after we've watched a text or read a text. The advice that the text gives to us. We should do more of this or we should do less of that. So usually in the form of a piece of advice. Thematic issues are oftentimes the one-word items that a theme is taught through. For example, the word family is a thematic issue. How family is dealt with can provide us with advice or a theme. Love is a thematic issue. Conflict is a thematic issue. How those one-word issues are handled can create the lesson that is more accurately called the theme. So we might see in the genre of the Western, for example, the idea of individualism is paramount in all of these stories. Additionally, there's usually the idea of the end of a frontier. Think about people moving west and they've reached Kansas. Think about other ones where they've made it farther west to Arizona. That idea of this is the end of everything we know and everything outside of this is barbaric and different and strange. That thematic issue of end of the frontier seems to come up time and time again in the genre of the Western. And each genre has its own set of themes that come up over and over again. Additionally, in all genres, we have what's called iconography, and these are repeated images that tend to come up in the evolution of the genre. Again, for example, in the Western, we tend to think of this stereotypical cowboy image, where on the left you might see, is this a traditional cowboy? Let's call him the stereotypical cowboy for a second. He's wearing jeans, big belt buckle, the vest, cowboy hat, probably has a revolver around his waist. He rides a horse with a Western saddle, not an English saddle, that kind of stuff. Then you can see over on the right images from some of the genre of the Western. Even when we look at the extension of the genre in something like Star Wars, Han Solo is costumed very similarly to the stereotypical cowboy. He has the blaster around his waist, not a revolver, but he has the vest, he has the jeans, that kind of stuff. So we're going to be able to identify certain repeated images that will be seen time and time again throughout the genre. Additionally, as we go through a genre, they tend to have similar moods or emotional settings. The Western has its own, the detective has its own mood. So the idea of mysterious confusion, solving the crime, we tend to have kind of a hopelessness feel at times because like we can never solve this until we get that one last clue. And then once we get that clue, everything unravels till we solve the crime. Sci-fi movies tend to be a little pessimistic about our future, as much as they try to say that everything's going to be perfect and everything's going to be utopian. Over and over again, the sci-fi genre tends to have a very negative mood of the future. If we look at the cinematic level of genres, we also get to see very similar styles in terms of how the genre is filmed. So the Western will look very different from the detective genre, which will look very different from the sci-fi genre. And not just in terms of set design. And sci-fi will probably have icons like spaceship, space travel, space suits, computers, things like that. But we're also talking about just how it looks cinematically. We tend to have a lot of open shots, a lot of long shots or high angles for the Western, where we tend to have many close-ups, many Dutch angles for things like the sci-fi genre. So we're really talking about that cinematic level. How is it filmed differently from other genres, but how is it consistent within the genre? So what's also interesting in terms of looking at genres is how they progress. So here are some stages that genres have seemed to have progressed through, kind of the evolution of genres. And it starts off with the idea of the primitive film in that genre. So somebody makes a movie, Little Caesar, kind of the gangster film of all gangster films. And this is pretty early in the idea of telling stories about the bad guy. And so they get the opportunity to establish patterns. They get the opportunity to establish themes. And they can kind of teach the lessons. Should we be idolizing the gangster? Should we feel sorry for the gangster? That kind of stuff. Since they are early on in the history of this genre, they are really setting the tone and pattern. And additionally, they're setting the iconography. So the idea of the trench coat, the low fedora over eyes, the handgun, revolver, sometimes the machine gun as we get the larger gang battles, that kind of stuff. But early on, as these films are being made, they were not thinking, hey, we're going to start a pattern. They were just making a film that seemed to resonate with the filmmakers, and then it resonated with the audience. And then the studio said, hey, if that one worked with this whole Little Caesar story, what if we tweaked it a little bit and told it this way? And lo and behold, it took off. People went to see it. The studio was happy. Audiences were happy. And the genre kind of was created in this primitive stage first. Once we've got the pattern established, we enter what's called the classical phase of the genre. The original patterns seem to continue. A lot of people say, hey, that new movie that came out, it's kind of like this other gangster movie. Oh, I want to see that too. So we get people who really love a certain genre. And studios were ecstatic because they knew they would get instant ticket sales. If Little Caesar did well, they're pretty sure that Double Indemnity, which is kind of in that same genre of gangster, of whodunit kind of stuff, that they're going to get an instant audience. And so those are very appealing to the studios because they know they can make money and people will watch them. But also we get the idea of basic values being solidified. So now, if we see this type of gun, it's probably in the gangster genre. If we see this type of hat or this type of plot point, it's probably in this type of genre. And we can kind of start to predict where the story is going. Because although they are slightly different, most films within a genre are basically the same. With time, though, people got weary of the same pattern over and over again, and we enter a new phase of the genre called the revisionist phase. And so we're going to have similar iconography. So if we're looking at the gangster genre, we're still going to have the bad guy who's kind of creepy and kind of shadowy. We're going to have the fedora and the revolver and the gangster idea. But the tone of the film itself becomes a little bit more complex and ambiguous. It's not so black and white. Like, this guy is bad, this guy is good. We start to have some gray areas. Who are we supposed to trust? Who really is the good guy? Oh my goodness, that detective who's supposed to be solving the crimes is a little strange himself. And so we start to have some deviation from the original kind of black and white patterns, and people are toying with the originals and kind of changing that at the same time. We then get into what is my favorite part of the genre evolution, and that is what we call the perotic phase. And this comes from the root of parody, which is basically where somebody is mocking something, where they're taking the original, twisting it a little bit more, and then kind of poking fun at the original through this new parody. So we get this idea in all genres, where eventually people start to look back on the genre and see kind of the silliness involved. Themes may be the same. So iconography will be highlighted, will be blown out of proportion, done over the top, really emphasized. Stock characters, who I've said before kind of linger in the background, tend to come to the forefront because they're so goofy, because they don't change, they don't grow, they don't really add anything. But in the perotic phase, all of a sudden they're exceptionally important. So if we're looking at our gangster genre, a parody of that might be Who Framed Roger Rabbit? It still has all the typical genre pieces. Good guy, bad guy, detective, a difficult crime to solve. We have the femme fatale in the case of Jessica Rabbit. We have the revolvers. We have all kinds of things that we've seen in the creation of the genre, but are now being blown out of proportion and twisted to kind of create more humor. And then finally, in the evolution of a genre, we would get what we call the extension. The original values of the gangster genre, good guy, bad guy, solve a difficult crime, tend to come back. But the structure of the film may be more modern. And so we could also have divergencies from the iconography. So instead of the revolver of the original part of the genre, we might have all of Batman's weaponry that he uses. He uses them in a similar fashion because he's solving crime. He is the amorphous, is he good, is he bad, but he's definitely fighting against some really bad guys. And so that is kind of the gangster genre, but it is very much taking the original and twisting it into something we hadn't seen before. And so I think as we look at the modern films that we tend to be watching today, many films don't really fit into one genre. There are always the romantic comedies that tend to follow the pattern of boy meets girl, boy loses girl, etc., etc. But they're going to twist those, they're going to add new things, they're going to change it, make it older people, make it two gay cowboys. They're going to twist that genre to be more appealing to today's audiences. And so we do have a look at uniqueness rather than speed of production. Now we would prefer something that comes out and is unique and different and makes us think. So that's about it for our first look at film genres, kind of a general overview of the idea of the genre, some of the names of the common patterns, and then some of the tools that pervade all of these. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to bring those into class. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you soon.